Hello everyone, welcome to the Houston Center interview series. Today we have the great privilege to talk to Reverend Dr. Andrew Bennett. Father Deacon Bennett spoke to us yesterday on occasion of a colloquium we had on euthanasia. We're very happy to have you here.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Father Deacon Bennett is Faith Community Program Director at Cardus. It's a non-partisan Christian think tank based in Ontario, devoted to reimagining institutional life for the common good. He's also an ordained deacon in the Ukrainian Greek-Catholic Church in the Eparchy of Toronto and Eastern Canada. And Father Deacon Andrew served as Canada's first ambassador for religious freedom and led Global Affairs Canada's Office of Religious Freedom from 2013 to 2016. He holds degrees from Dalhousie University, McGill, and the University of Edinburgh. So we thought we'd begin by asking you a little bit about how you got to where you are. So tell us a little bit about your intellectual, spiritual formation. I always say to my students, what books have you read?
Yeah.
What people have influenced you, and to take you where you are now? And what are your concerns right now in your work? I know it's abroad, but maybe you could just
Sure.
give a bit of background. Yeah.
Sure. You know, I thought about this for quite a while, and trying to piece together what are these key aspects of who I am and how I got to be where I am. So maybe to break them down intellectually, spiritually, and maybe some literary and musical influences, because I think those are important as well for the whole person. So intellectually, certainly we'll just take the Word of God as understood. So certainly that, the Scriptures, Holy Tradition. But then I would say Aristotle with just enough Plato. And then I would probably, going into the Church Fathers, especially St. Athanasius, St. Maximus the Confessor, St. Gregory Palamas. And then, moving into, wonderful writers such as Chesterton and Jacques Maritain, so lots of personalist influence, I would say, in my background, especially in my thinking about politics. And so that certainly leads also to St. John Paul II and to Pope Benedict, Ratzinger's thought. So that'd be sort of maybe the intellectual strand. The spiritual strand would probably be a mixture. Certainly, I'm strongly indebted to sort of a lot of church fathers who are more interested, focused on the spiritual life. St. John Climacus would be a big influence on me, and the Ladder of Divine Ascent, which I come back to again and again every year at Lent. I would also say our family, my parents are Roman Catholics, and my mum, before she died, had great devotion to Sainte Thérèse of Lisieux. So Carmelite spirituality, which I think has a lot of connections with Byzantine spirituality. So certainly Sainte Thérèse of Lisieux and her thoughts, her witness. St. John of Kronstadt, great pastor of late 19th century Russia. And then literary influences that weave their way in. I'm a big devotee of George Herbert, Henry Vaughan, and those metaphysical poets of 17th century England. And I would certainly say, in all categories, St. John Henry Newman. So Newman is an ever-present companion, constantly forming me. Usually always reading something by Newman.
Okay, interesting.
And then musically, Palestrina. Again, we'll take Bach as understood. But Palestrina, I really think that, getting to the second part of your question, what Palestrina teaches me, Tallis teaches me, is one thing that we are sorely lacking in our current moment in society, and that is wonder. A loss of a sense of wonder, which is, I think, bound up with contemplation, but certainly we need to contemplate to wonder, but this inability to see beyond ourselves. That's a major challenge. That's preoccupying me at the present time, and that connects also with what I came and spoke about last night, thanks to your gracious invitation on sort of Christian anthropology, incarnational anthropology in light of euthanasia. So that's probably a broad broad sweep of key influences in my life, both influencing the mind and the heart.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, we want to come back to the euthanasia just as an example, maybe an application of some of the things that interest you. I'm just I want to ask you a little bit more about your emphasis on the person. Like when did that emerge in your intellectual formation? I mean, we have obviously a common reference with Jacques Maritain, whom I discovered through my research on Bonhoeffer and human rights, on natural law. How did you arrive at this concern for the person, which is part of the wonder and the mystery, right? Because
Absolutely.
the mystery of the person is what's disappearing or
Absolutely.
what we need to recover. Yeah.
Well, I would actually take it back quite a ways to a very precocious 8-year-old Andrew Bennett in Toronto, growing up in Toronto. And one of my earliest, I think, well-formed political memories was when martial law was imposed in Poland in the early 1980s. And this is after John Paul II had gone back to Poland and had given these powerful talks and homilies at the masses that he celebrated there. And the people responded with the chants of, "We want God, we want God." And so St. John Paul II spoke very powerfully to them about who they were as people. But I would say that maybe another influence, and someone who I seek his intercession regularly, is Blessed Jerzy Popiełuszko, this great martyr of the communist period in Poland, who in his Masses for the Fatherland that he celebrated in Warsaw from St. Stanisław Kostka parish, before his martyrdom, he continually preached about the dignity of the human person and the importance of the human person, that you are not an object, but rather a subject. And so even at 8 years old, I didn't have a well-formed understanding of, obviously, incarnational anthropology, or I'd never heard of Jacques Maritain, certainly. But I remember being profoundly touched and moved by him. And so maybe there was a seed planted at that time. And I think I can trace maybe a bit of a lineage in my formation back to that impressionable 8-year-old Andrew, who had that encounter with something that seemed to matter in a very big way. And so I think the Holy Spirit has been constantly working to draw me into that particular focus on the dignity of the human person. So as I reflect back now, age 50, I can see that sort of golden thread that's woven through how our Lord has asked me to serve Him, and in the intellectual formation that I've had and the opportunities He's given to me. So I'm very grateful, and I'm very grateful to Blessed Jerzy.
So let me ask you, this is a self-serving academic nerd question. Like, what other personalists? I mean, there's John Paul II is a great personalist, philosopher, phenomenologist, and so on. What other personalist thinkers have you looked at? Like Mounier?
Mounier, to a certain extent. I mean, Mounier he's quite dense, but certainly a foundational personalist thinker for the work of both Maritain and St. John Paul II. But I would hold up Martin Luther King, great personalist, thinker. Yeah. And that's, I certainly think about how he would approach some of the challenges we have today through that personalist lens. To really, he would certainly rail against a lot of the trends in our present day society that are very dehumanizing. Yeah. I think he would have a lot to say, and if you look at what he had to say in his letter from Birmingham jail, this really works out in that context of 1960s, late 1960s, the 1950s U.S. civil rights movement. This understanding of the dignity of the human person, and I think Dr. King has a lot to teach us today, and I think a lot of Christians and especially a lot of Catholics would do well to read his work and to see it through that personalist lens and see how we can represent that argument and those points to people especially as we engage some of these really these significant challenges that progressivism brings to us.
Okay, with that keyword, let's turn to our topic from last night, euthanasia. As we said last night, there was a general consensus both in the main lecture and the panelists that this has become a runaway train. I mean, as you put it, where the euthanasia laws, the policies put in place and that are meant to be put in place in Canada really point out a pretty dark path of, where individualism goes rampant, subjective experience over any kind of a greater community context, how this might affect society as a whole. The right to die, the right to be, frankly, as you said, to be murdered by a physician, like all these kind of things. And I do wonder, like the question that wasn't asked is, what does that actually do to physicians? Like we had lots of doctors in the audience, and I would have liked to hear, like, how do they think when a healer becomes the killer, in that sense. As we have the situation, maybe I can just ask you to apply your understanding of the person, which would give you an opportunity, which I would welcome, to maybe just delineate a little bit what you think constitutes the dignity of a person as made in the image of God, I would assume, anthropologically, and what you think is diminished or how that is undermined in our current euthanasia policies.
Well, for Christians, matter matters. We are saved through matter. Our flesh matters. And so, yes, we're created in the image and likeness of God. And that cannot be a subjective or purely individualistic understanding, because we cannot exist without other human beings. It's cliche to say we are social creatures. That's not enough, though. We can't just stop at that sort of sociological understanding or a secular anthropological understanding. As Christians, we have to have the courage to speak about the incarnation and to use incarnational language to represent to people today who they are, because we're dealing with a very serious amnesia in our culture. People have forgotten who they are. And the incarnation, along with the resurrection, is the single greatest event in all of human history. That God, who is so great, could become so small. That the creator of all things could be contained in the womb of the Blessed Virgin. And then to fundamentally change our understanding of who we are and what it means to be human, to be called to participation in that Trinitarian life. Now, as Christians, we can use that language, and we need to use that language more and more in our churches. We need to be explicit about it, and we need to inspire in people a zeal to speak about the incarnation in charity, in humility, as they go out into the world. But then we also have to be able to take that language of incarnational anthropology and bring it to people in their daily lives, in their vocations, so that they can see who they are, and to know that the deep conscience that they have is, I love Newman's wonderful expression that conscience is this, using an antiquated meaning of the word, but the aboriginal vicar of Christ within us, that all of us have. And so I think that is bound up in the incarnation. And so we have to help people reawaken that. And I remember chatting last night with a doctor who was present at the event and at the reception, and he was saying how many of his colleagues have suppressed their conscience and have pushed it down so deeply that when it does get pricked by something, they're shocked by the reaction that it comes with it. So I think, especially as the church and as Christians, we need to emphasize to people again who they are, that they need one another, that they exist within a community. And I think one of the greatest things that Catholic social teaching can offer, especially to a world that has a very false understanding of equality and so forth, is to say, as Christians, we believe that we are radically equal because of the incarnation, because we're created in the image and likeness of God. And that radical equality is far deeper than any superficial equality or diversity or inclusion that might be advanced that is very, very diminished, a very diminished understanding of the person. So I think we need to call people back to that radical equality that finds its fullest expression in what the incarnation has given to us.
Let me try this on you. So conscience, your emphasis on conscience, I like it very much. There's another sort of reading in the German tradition, which may be a bad thing, that conscience is, this comes sort of out of Heidegger, Ricoeur, and Bonhoeffer. They say, yes, conscience is a reminder, like inbuilt, if you want, of our relation to God, and it calls us back to this relation. But it's really in our fallenness. It's a sign of that relation has been broken. So conscience cries out, but it doesn't understand what it's crying out for. So it can be filled and perverted with all other kinds of things. So you can't, like on their account, you can't really trust conscience. Like you predicted, like if it gets pricked, like you have the sort of what I would call the Bunyan reading, John Bunyan reading of the conscience, right? It's like the sort of the drunk Lord Mayor in the city, right? Who still blurts out the eternal law of God and therefore terrifies people in these moments. So for this other tradition, it's more like our consciences can be so warped by cultural presuppositions that this mechanism kind of, it reminds us of something, but we don't really know, and we can fill this with all other kinds of aspirations toward Godhood, which are wrong. So whether we agree on this or not, or whether this is plausible, but I'm wondering, let's take that interpretation for a minute. What kind of replacements of the sort of God consciousness, if you will, function, you think, in modernity that are anthropological presuppositions, who we are, that sort of falsify the conscience, our God consciousness. What would you say sort of are reigning anthropological assumptions that go against the notion of the person that you've begun to outline?
Well, if we understand theology as words about God, or maybe more particular, theoprepiis logi, so words that are particular to God. I'll answer your question first by saying, let's look at the reigning theology. I am God.
Right.
So once I become God, then nothing else really makes a lot of sense from an incarnational perspective. But I would agree with you about this aspect of the conscience. I mean, the conscience has to be ordered. The conscience has to be formed. And context is very important. That's why I emphasize the incarnation. So understanding the conscience outside of proper formation, it can go all sorts of places that are not good. Let's take something very simple, a very simple example. People who are married, the husband or the wife might say, well, my conscience is telling me to do this. But if that has a negative impact on your spouse and on your children, well, then that hints at maybe a bit of a deformed conscience. Because you have to, once you're married, you've made a commitment to your spouse, you've made a commitment to your children. And so you're exercising your conscience in that context. During the pandemic, there were a lot of priests and pastors and others who railed against a lot of the restrictions that were put in place. Now, were some of those restrictions, did they go beyond prudence? Sure. They weren't maybe necessarily prudential. They were a bit reactionary at times. But if you're a priest or a pastor, especially within a particular church or denomination, you can't really go rogue in saying my conscience tells me to do this, because you have if you're certainly a Catholic priest or an Orthodox priest, you have obedience to your bishop, and so you operate in the context of that relationship to the bishop and to Holy Tradition and to Holy Scriptures and what the bishop articulates. If you're a pastor, you have to be conscious. What do your fellow pastors say? What about your denomination? What does it say? So we have to recognize that our conscience is not something to be bandied about willy-nilly. But then how do we communicate that to people today who do not have that particular understanding of conscience, the incarnational lens to look through, or rather see conscience as license.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think I should do this. And so therefore my emotions dictate I should do this, therefore I will do it. Well, that will get you into a lot of trouble. And this points to, I think, maybe a question that maybe we can get into around freedom. What does it mean to be free? Freedom has to have limits. The goal of freedom is not to be free. The goal of freedom is to do the good. It's the freedom to pursue the good, to pursue truth, to pursue meaning. And once you've encountered that truth, it's the freedom to govern your entire life according to truth. Same thing with progress. The end of progress is not just progress. Progress has to have a definable end towards something. And we know this in every aspect of our lives. You know, as we progress through a graduate degree, the end goal, please God, is a doctoral thesis or a major paper. If you are going on holidays with your family, the progress of driving along the highway, the end goal is the cottage. If you're training to be an electrician, as you work your way through apprentice, journeyman, the end goal of that progress is your red seal. So to think that the end of progress is progress itself, or the end of freedom is freedom itself, is dehumanizing. And it diminishes the human person into an object. And we can get into that in a broader way, but I think that when we're speaking to people about their conscience, when we're speaking to them about what is it that drives them, that leads them to meet what David Novak at U of T refers to as the metaphysical need of every person, we have to be able to pose those questions and say, what is it that you seek?
Yeah.
What do you desire? And are your mind and your heart in concert with one another, or are you all fractured?
So help me here. Apply this more directly to the euthanasia issue, like all the things that you just said. So, I mean, you hear people say, to take this decision as a realization of my autonomy, let's say.
Right.
And I know you've talked about this a little last night. So elaborate a little how these sentiments and therefore a malformed conscience through some sort of modern anthropological assumptions, how do you see that play out in the euthanasia debate?
Well, I think first thing I would say is that people who are actively seeking euthanasia, as we've heard last night, often the actual medical condition that they're dealing with is not often the greatest factor for what is leading them to make that decision. It's an understanding that dignity is all about external propriety. So if I can't live my life as I want to live it, or as I think society says I should live it, if I'm a burden to people, if I can't maximize what I think my potential is physically or mentally, well then I'm not me. And so we get into this disordered understanding of what dignity is. Dignity becomes about external propriety, about maximizing my social, my economic, my physical, mental potential. And dignity is something that is deeply within. It's not about external propriety. And when we make it about external propriety, well, then again, we have a very deformed understanding of the human person. And now, I can understand people who seek this when they want to be in control and they can't control their lives. And in some cases, maybe they're experiencing deep loneliness, isolation, suicidal ideation. And I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but what I hear from those people who do engage with these patients and people that are seeking euthanasia, there's a myriad of other things that are going on, spiritually, psychologically, that may be what's actually driving them towards that decision. But again, at the most fundamental level, euthanasia, where the individual patient or person wants to be in control, and in exercising that control, they want to end their life or have someone else end their life, that represents a profound rupture in community, a profound break in community. on the one hand, it says that maybe we're not reaching out to this person and building community with this person. You think about the cases we've heard about people who are homeless or might be homeless, who are approaching doctors for euthanasia, and we're getting approval. Or it's about people who feel that, and it's a feeling, it's an emotion, they feel that they are now worthless. And they can't see themselves in community. And so this is where the church and other faith communities really have to step up and speak about community not as something that is purely of a secular nature. There's lots of different communities out there, but speak about real, true human community that is built upon self-sacrifice, that is built upon love, that is built upon friendship, and a desire to be present to that person and to suffer with them. And again, this point was made last night by a number of people, we must not underestimate suffering. Human suffering is very hard, especially when we see very grave suffering. And so if people have a sense that suffering is a wicked, awful thing that is unredeemable, then you can understand how we move down the path of radical autonomy and euthanasia. But how do we, again, use Christian language, the Christian tradition, what we know about our humanity, in the light of the incarnation, in the light of the resurrection, whereby we can bring hope to people, and also offer them clear alternatives, such as effective palliative care. Why is that conversation stalled in our country? This is a very, very slippery, I think you said falling off a cliff more than a slippery slope. Anyhow, I'll leave it at that.
It's stunning when you think about what Neil Belanger said last night. We had a representative of the indigenous, what's it called, the group for the disability among the indigenous people, spokesperson, highly, he's all over, spoken to government committees and so on. But what he related to us is this absurdity where we're there fighting for community among the indigenous and to save suicidal, depressed teenagers from suicide. And yet we're poised in Canada to offer MAID to precisely those kind of people. So that's like this absurd contradiction when I think we've completely lost any kind of anthropological ground or a greater context. I love what you said about life. I mean, we've kind of switched from an emphasis on life to our radical autonomy, which then absurdly wants to embrace death in this kind of nihilistic. I mean, there's a Christian embrace of death, which is life-giving.
Yes.
And there's this one who's just completely self-destructive.
But people know this. They know this deep down, and that's why you see all these incongruities. Yeah,
and so Neil he's not a Christian, but the drive of the value of the individual, love for community, we seem to be all singing from the same song sheet, right? So it's really interesting. So people do know it.
Yes, absolutely.
But they may lack the vocabulary to articulate it, because much of this comes from a Christian tradition or Judeo-Christian tradition that we've forgotten.
Well, and the fruit of radical autonomy is a communal permissiveness that is very destructive. Whether you look at whether it's the downtown east side, here in Vancouver, or whether it's in and around the Byward Market now in Ottawa, with this rampant crisis of homelessness, mingled with addiction and mental illness and so forth. And it is a scandal that this exists. And they're wonderful, the Union Gospel Mission and the Shepherds of Good Hope and these various Christian entities that are there ministering to people, because they see in them God. God is present in that person. Whether they're Christian or any other religion or atheist or whatever, there is Christ, and I have to act. But the other side of that in the secular world is this sort of permissiveness. Well, if they want to be homeless, maybe they want to be homeless. No, that is not right.
Yes.
Or, if they want to live their life that way, that's how they're going to live their life. I'm sorry, we can't allow that in a society that is, I think, predicated on a certain, like originally, a certain understanding of the human person.
Yes, and I just read a book on patristics and euthanasia, which made the interesting point that so much, as you said earlier, depends on the framing of the whole picture. So that if you begin to recognize that for decades, our understanding what a sovereign act of the will is framed by this whole sort of secularistic, nihilistic, framework driven by a distortion of what genuine autonomy is, and so on, then the actual act that you think you're embracing here of asserting your dignity becomes actually a perverse affirmation of non-dignity, because you're just an object really within the system. You're just something that's an obstacle to the system, and you're in your very act of saying I have the dignity of deciding how to die is you don't realize that the system has already dictated to you your worthlessness. The system has already told you that you're just an object that's in the way, and you're actually bizarrely embracing this and saying I assert my dignity, and it's really, you're asserting nothing. You're asserting self-destructiveness rather than being carried, loved,
Exactly.
It's just stunning.
Well, I'll go back to one of my favorite spiritual fathers that I mentioned at the top of our interview, St. John Climacus. Here St. John of Sinai, also known as St. John of Sinai, he's writing in, the 7th century, in the deserts of Sinai at St. Catherine's Monastery. And one thing that comes back again and again as he explores on these steps of dealing with the passions and acquiring the virtues in the spiritual life, that there are some thoughts that are not good thoughts.
Yeah.
Not all thoughts that come into our head are good thoughts. And how we address those, as they say in Greek, logismi. Logismos is a bad thought. And where do those bad thoughts come from? And so there's a whole, obviously, cosmology around that. But we have to really point out, I think, to people that just because you think this is a good idea does not make it true, good, or beautiful. And so when I read every year the Ladder of Divine Ascent, I think to myself, how does this 7th century monk know me so well? Because despite all of our technological advances, we still are dealing with the same challenges in our spiritual lives and in how we understand, our body, mind, and soul, and how they're meant to work together. And when they're in chaos and fractured, which is a result of the fall, then we're constantly trying to understand, who am I?
Yeah.
And certainly as Christians, we believe that Christ brings order out of that chaos. So again, this is an important role for Christians and those that would be, I'll use a very woke term, our allies in the world, to again remind people who they are and to help them process ideas, and not just in a psychological way, but in a spiritual way as well.
A spiritual way. So let me, I had another question for you, but I'll come back to that. I do want to press you a bit more yet on what you think constitutes a person made in the image of God. But the segue is just too good. So if I want to follow that appeal, I've been thinking about this for a while, that there is a division or a misalignment between the kind of views that you find in this Desert Father because of a certain, you can call it cosmology or a view of reality, a certain metaphysics that many in the ancient world assumed, which are called sort of fancy participatory ontology. I call it a form of realism, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, being participates in the being of God in some sense, therefore it exists. Or you can use the Stoic Logos doctrine, which gets drawn into Christianity and transformed. Mm-hmm. Christ the Logos, in whom all things hang together, and therefore all things are connected. And therefore our if I can argue about what are good and bad thoughts on that basis, because we're connected to a higher reality, to an order in which our consciousness is embedded, to which it should conform, which in the ancient world people would have said yes. And this is why, as you said earlier, I can have wonder because the openness to what is,
Mm-hmm.
right, is something I can explore with confidence. That's something will talk back to me. And I feel that wherever you cut the line, and maybe Hegel was the last great sort of realist in a perverted sense, like that we've lost that. So the big divide or the misalignment is that we no longer think that my innermost senses, intuitions, feelings align with the higher order. Right? And that sort of seems to cut across Christian and non-Christian lines. Right? I mean, there are lots of Christians, like students I have, they don't even know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And then when I say, well, if it says Christ in you, what does that mean to you?
Yes.
And they just kind of schizophrenically think, well, that means that Christ is present. But how can he be if in the order of the cosmology or the metaphysics that you embrace as a modern person, there's nothing out. There's nothing that we align with. Right? Say something about this. Like,
well, we have to seize those moments of questioning, because again, I'm profoundly convinced, just in my own pastoral work that I do as a deacon, especially with young adults, where they desire. They want to understand themselves, and they want to understand how they are related to others and how they're related to God, and how it all fits together.
Yeah.
And our current secularist culture does not offer them that because there's no depth to it. And so I want to talk a little bit about living that type of life that you've just described. How do we live liturgically? How do we live sacramentally?
Right. Yes.
But I'll just give you two stories from my own ministry. The first is one that I've told on a number of occasions, of a young man, university age, who came to study at this small liberal arts college in Ottawa that I taught at for many years, Augustine College. We'll call him John. And he arrives and he loves to sing. He's got a good musical sense. Comes from a family that had sort of Baptist and Pentecostal roots. And they were, a faithful family, but he was trying to figure out what this all meant. Is this my parents' faith that I was brought up in, or is it actually what I believe? So he shows up in Ottawa and hears about this choir, and he loves to sing. And it's this choir that sings sort of the Slavic Byzantine repertoire at this church, St. John the Baptist Ukrainian Catholic Shrine in Ottawa, where I'm service deacon. And this is before I was ordained deacon, and I was teaching church history at this college. And so John shows up and starts, singing with his choir in this church. And the church is dark on, Thursday nights when they're practicing. And so he decides, well, I'm away from home. I'm going to explore. And so he starts coming to the regular Sunday Divine Liturgy. And I was a subdeacon at that time, and so I was in the pews, and I remember standing next to John and seeing him just look around, taking in all the iconography, and because he could read music and was very musically inclined, he picked up the chant very quickly, so he was singing. We have an older tradition of congregational singing, of chanting. And you could just see him delighting in this. And then months down the road, he said, Dr. Bennett, I think I'm called to be a Catholic. And I played the devil's advocate a bit. I said, a Roman Catholic? I mean, you sort of come from a Baptist, Pentecostal, Western tradition. Yeah. It would be a Roman Catholic. And he said, no, I want to be a Greek Catholic, Ukrainian Greek-Catholic. And I said, well, John, I remember when you first came to our church, you were really taken in by the icons and by the the beauty of the chant. Is that what has led you to make this decision? And he looked at me and he said, no. It's because of what's happening on that altar. So here's a young man who had no background in Byzantine liturgy, let alone Eucharistic theology. But without anyone telling him, he knew that all of this beauty was not there just for itself, but was ordered towards something much higher. First story. Second story. Young man shows up at a group that I lead called Saints, Young Adults Group, to talk about different aspects of the faith. And I'd never seen him before. and we were talking. I can't remember what the subject was, but afterwards he came up and he said, "I've got a lot of questions." I said, "Oh, okay." So what are your questions? And he had a lot of questions, and was clearly a very intelligent young man. And he said, "Could I meet with you and just talk through a few things?" I said, "Sure, of course." So that led to a number of conversations. And this young man was baptized Catholic, but was not raised in a Catholic home at all. Decided he was an atheist by his mid to late teens. But his guidance counselor in high school realized that he was smart, and so suggested that he go to a particular university program where it was a focus on sort of Western civilization. Well, he started reading Aristotle and Plato and Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, and he then thought, well, I need to maybe check out church. So he explored for a little while different churches, eventually found his way to our parish. And remember, he asked me in one of our conversations, he said, "What do I need to come back into the church?" I said, "Well, you're a Catholic, you're a baptized Catholic." He said, "Yes." I said, "You need to make a confession, and then you can receive the Eucharist." He said, "That's it?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay." So I helped him sort of prepare for his confession. And he came back into the church and became tremendously faithful, devout, and married a Ukrainian Greek-Catholic woman. And a couple of years after this happened, I asked him, I said, "What was it that drew you into embracing your faith?" And he gave me a very simple answer. He said, "Because it's the truth. And I wanted the truth." So I think so often in our society today, people are buffeted by all these varying winds, and they get disconnected from their spiritual life. They don't even know if they have a spiritual life. They seek it out in various odd ways because they're hardwired to seek. They're hardwired to seek truth and to seek meaning, but they're not gaining any. There's no progress. There's no ground gained, and they want order in their lives. They want to be grounded in truth. And so I think as Christians, we offer a way of living life liturgically, in ordering our days, in living a sacramental life that puts Christ first, not ourselves first. And when you do that, wow, okay, there's freedom. I am going to bind myself within this tradition, and in limiting my freedom in that way, I'm actually going to be free, and I can go deep. And these young adults that I work with, they want to go very deep. They don't want chopped, they don't want ground beef. They want beef bourguignon.
Okay, this is really I'm going to translate this for myself, what you've just said, and tell me if you would say, yes, I agree. So for me, as an academic in a Christian academic institution, I think there's a danger of thinking that we first need to conceptually re-prepare the ground in people's minds. Why it is that they're hungry but can't find, like why it is that their modern consciousness has sort of obliterated the kind of realism that was like the sacramental thinking that was there, and then then the door is open, and then you can receive. What you're saying is a bit the opposite. I'm sure you're not saying that that's not needed, but what you're saying is if the church, not instead, but actually just simply preaches the truth, which people are looking for, and practices sacramentally, liturgically, that life that people are drawn to, so that they fall in love with that or find what they're looking for, and then as they are in that, they try to conceptually understand it. Like then that is also an important element. But if we just bank on, let's educate you guys, you people, that's not enough. Like that's
right. No, it's fides et ratio, faith and reason.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And as Pope Benedict said at the beginning of his pontificate, open wide the doors to Christ. Yeah. And that can come through certainly through the intellectual path, but also the path of beauty, and of deep experience with what you're being called to in your spiritual life. So I think the work of a place like Regent or any other, college that is deeply embedded within the Christian tradition.
Yeah.
There are two goals, and Regent knows that well. But to give people, to give students and young adults, give them the full banquet. Full.
Yeah. Say more. Yeah.
Say more. Like just give them everything. Don't hold back. Don't give them a way to continually join themselves to Christ.
Yeah.
To join themselves intellectually to Him. To join themselves in their artistic abilities, in their hearts, in every aspect of their lives, and to live that out in their daily lives in a way that is not, with the ghetto walls nice and high, but open into the world. I love Father Alexander Zimmermann and his classic work for the life of the world.
Yeah.
This is not just about us.
Yeah.
This is for the life of the world.
Yeah.
And getting back to euthanasia, we have a responsibility as Christians to be there for those that would go down that path. And so we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
And the work that Regent does is so crucial in this respect. So I applaud what you're doing. I think it's really crucial.
Well, I don't want this to answer that on a commercial for Regent. I thank you for those kind words. But I was struck yesterday, and we should probably end here, how you're called to, a Christian anthropology, a theological anthropology rooted in the Incarnation, and you had very little time. So I would have liked to hear more. And you said rooted in, therefore in Christ, in Christology, how that ought to be at the center of this, right? Maybe you could just say just a little bit, these last sort of couple of minutes, how you find not just strength but also vision in that for your work. You're with Cardus, so this is a public engagement for civic society, right? It's not just a church thing. It's the church as the center from which you want to draw people in. It's much of my concern also. God became human in Christ so that we could become fully human. Without by becoming deified. So that's the Christian desire, but it's a destiny for all human beings.
Yes, that's right.
So we want to be in conversation with, we want to work with anybody who wants to ennoble humanity, right, in society and so on. So I'm just wondering, incarnation, Christology, how does that inspire you? How does that carry you in your sort of public policy tasks? Even you were, I don't remember what the exact title was, but freedom of religion.
Yeah, ambassador,
ambassador, right? That was your portfolio.
Yes.
Our government doesn't seem to be very concerned about freedom of religion these days, right? And you have a very good definition of freedom. So that aspect too. Just say a few final words on how that carries you or inspires you for your public vocation, your public work.
Well, at Cardus, we always speak about our research and our commentary and anything that we do, that it has to be faithful, public, and credible. And so anything that we do as Christians when we're engaging the public square has to be faithful first, public, and credible. I think for a very long time as Christians, we have bought into this myth of late modernity that my faith is a private matter.
Yeah.
And it is not. That is not only theologically inaccurate, it is historically inaccurate. And so I think what Cardus does very well is, in a way that is explicit sometimes and implicit other times, it opens the public square. It opens it up and says, if we're going to live with one another, if we're going to shape the common good, then we need to be there. The public square can't be this sort of gated community where there's one particular orthodoxy, because then you can't live with one another. Excuse me. So we have to have that open public square. What Father Richard John Newhouse called the naked public square, and then to find one another there, to encounter one another there, and in encountering one another, okay, we're going to encounter Christ, and that's why we're there, is for that engagement with one another, And, I'm really committed, in my ministry. And I mean, certainly in the ontological understanding of the Eastern churches and the Catholic Church, once you're ordained, you're ontologically changed.
Yeah.
So I am now a deacon.
Yeah.
And so my entire life is diaconal. And so everything has to be seen as diaconal. And sometimes, diaconia gets poorly translated as service. But I think there's something more in the Greek where diaconia means basically the act of being called into service. So for all of us as Christians, what are the many opportunities we have to be called into service? And I think we have to be much more aware of those opportunities as they present themselves. And so in my particular work, you have to have an open heart to people. And also not to engage in kumbaya.
Yes.
Like, be authentic.
Yeah.
And one thing we found in a lot of our survey work that we've done at Cardus through the Angus Reid Institute is that 18 to 34 age cohort, within the margin of error, are actually slightly more religious than the 35 to 54 age cohort. And they're also very focused on authenticity. So, be authentically yourself. You're an Orthodox Christian? Great. I'm not, but I want you to be an Orthodox Christian. And tell me what that means. So these moments of engagement in the public square, we have to really present ourselves fully as we are.
Yeah.
And because if we hold back, you've got to be prudent, obviously, and winsome. But if we hold back, then we're lying to people.
Yeah. And what you're kind of saying is people smell a weasel.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
So be fully yourself.
Yeah.
And as a very holy monk who I know said to me once after I gave one of my first homilies, he said, "Father Deacon Andrew, give it to them straight. Mm-hmm. They can take it. Mm-hmm. Give it to them straight." And so we have to do that. We have to give it to people straight because it's our Lord and it's the gospel. And don't dilute it, but present it in a way that it can be received. Right. And that's what we do at Cardus, in an implicit way that we're trying to present through our commentaries, through our research, through our publications, through our networking. How do we see one another present in that public square? And that's what we have to work hardest at.
Okay, well, this is great. Thank you so much. You certainly gave it to us straight.
Yeah, thanks, Jens.
Thank you for being here with us. I greatly appreciate it. I wish you all the best for your ongoing work.
Thank you.
And I hope we can have you again.
Please, God.
Okay,
Thank you.